Hey folks, David Molnar here. Welcome back to the free video series on Aperture. In this lesson, we're gonna go pretty advanced and we're gonna talk about how Aperture directly affects strobes and really how shutter speed doesn't have a ton of effect when lighting your subjects. All right, so first of all, when I say strobes, I am specifically talking about studio strobes that are off camera and not necessarily the flash that is built into some of your camera bodies, right? I'm not necessarily talking about that. Now, all flashes work the same in that they're there and gone really fast. This is technically a flash, but when I refer to strobes, I'm usually talking about something like this. Now, of course, you can use an external flash that's not built into your camera like this Canon 580. You could use that, and that would certainly work the same. It's just probably not gonna be as powerful as something like the Einstein that's made by Paul Buff. Now, there are tons of companies that make all different types of strobes, but this is my strobe of choice. And I'm not paid to say that, I just actually love this strobe. Okay, so a couple things you need to understand about flash in general is that flash, kind of like a lightning strike, is there and gone super fast. Now, a lightning strike might hit several times, but it's there and gone like super fast. And then it might be burned into your eyes. You might feel like you're seeing it for a couple seconds, but in all reality, it's there and gone super fast. It's the same thing with a strobe, okay? In fact, I can push that button right there. I push the test button, which can fire a test. That light is there and gone so fast. In fact, it's about a 4,000th of a second. Now, different strobes will have different durations, but approximately 4 or 5,000th of a second, okay? So fast, so fast. The strobe is there and gone, okay? So it's important to understand that there is actually, not more light, unless the strobe hits the second time. If it's just there and gone one time, there's only so much light that goes out. Now, it might be a lot of light, but a lot of light goes and hits your subject really fast, and then it's gone, right? The strobe isn't hitting multiple times, okay? The strobe isn't there like a constant light, like the light that's hitting my face right now. It's not there for a long duration of time. Therefore, your camera can't like soak up extra light by leaving the exposure or the shutter speed open for a longer duration of time. So let me give you an example. If you are shooting in a pitch black, dark room, let's say you're shooting a gorgeous, model, okay, in a pitch black, dark room, okay? And the only light that hits your model's face is a strobe like that, okay? It is there and gone in a 4,000th, 5,000th of a second, okay? There and gone, all right? Technically, the same amount of light will hit your subject regardless of whether you're shooting for a 200th of a second or 10 seconds. Because if it's a pitch black, dark room, there's no other light anywhere, okay? The only light that hits your subject is that strobe, okay? And it's there and gone in a 4,000th of a second. And as long as that strobe, let's say this is your timeline, okay? This is 200th of a second, and this is 10 seconds, okay? Let's look at a visual timeline for a second. As long as that strobe hits, that 4,000th of a duration of a second hits in that time, okay? If this is 200th, and this is 10 seconds. As long as the strobe hits somewhere in that space, somewhere in that duration of time, there is no difference in the amount of light that hits your subject with this amount of time or this amount of time. Because technically, that strobe was there and gone just somewhere in a very small fraction during this time period, and the same thing happened. It was there and gone when it was 10 seconds. So really, when we're talking about lighting our subjects, when we're talking about the light that hits our subjects' faces from the strobe specifically, the light that comes out from the electronic device that is flashing, when we're talking about that light, I'm not talking about the other lights that may be in the room, because that doesn't matter, because we're in a pitch black, dark room. The light that comes out from this is there and gone, and it's no different. Your picture would look no different whether you're at 200th of a second, 60th of a second, or 10 seconds. It doesn't matter, as long as that strobe is there and gone in the appropriate window of time, okay? Your images would look identical at 200th of a second and 10 seconds. And so for some of y'all, that's kind of like it's kind of crazy to think about it, because well, if I leave my shutter speed open for a longer duration of time, then more light is going to flood in. This is like a photography an exposure triangle principle, okay? If you leave your shutter speed, more light comes in, but not necessarily when you're talking about a strobe light hitting your subject. Okay, so remember, we are only in a dark room, a pitch black dark room. There is no other light available. The only light is coming from the strobe, and it's there and gone super fast. And if the amount of time doesn't affect the brightness or the exposure of the image or the exposure on our subject's face, if we're talking about shooting a model, then what would affect it? Okay. Well, technically, the other two factors of the exposure triangle will, of course, affect it, ISO and aperture. But when you're shooting a strobe, you can output a lot of light. And really ideally, if you have a lot of available light, you want to shoot at a lower ISO number because that will have less grain or less noise in your image. So when I'm shooting with strobes, I typically leave my ISO at ISO 100 and forget it. I don't mess with it again. Occasionally, I'll go to ISO 200 and possibly 400, but typically, whatever the situation is, I will set my ISO and I will just forget it and leave it there. So once you set your ISO probably to 100 or 200 if you're on some Nikon cameras, right? Then you forget it, you leave it. And so now the only thing that affects the exposure on your subject's face when you're shooting a strobe with a flash of light that is there and gone so fast is the size of the hole. And very obviously, even just in general in photography, right? It doesn't matter whether you're shooting with strobes or not. The larger hole, more light is gonna come in. The smaller hole, less light will come in. It just makes sense. So it's the same thing if you're shooting without a strobe or with a strobe. The larger hole lets more light in. The smaller hole lets less light in. So when you are shooting strobes, a flash that is there and gone in an instant, the only thing after you set your ISO and forget it, that affects the exposure or the amount of light that's hitting your subject's face is the size of the hole, okay? The f-stops, the aperture, is the only thing that affects the exposure on your subject's face when you're shooting with strobes in a dark room and there's no other light present, okay? So aperture is what directly affects strobes, and really it's the only thing you should really be concerned with because you set your ISO and you leave it. You set your shutter speed to generally around 125th of a second, possibly 200th, and you leave it there. So it almost makes it more simple because the only thing you really have to worry about is just simply the size of the hole. Now, when we are measuring light, when we are measuring the output of that strobe, we talk about it in a studio setting or maybe on location if you have strobes with you. We talk about the power that's coming out of this light measured in f-stops. So if we say, hey, I want to shoot at f11, well, there are these off-camera light meters, I don't have one next to me right now, where you can essentially like press a button and it will trigger that strobe and it will flash light on your subject as long as you have the light pointed at your subject. And then this light meter, once you trigger it, it will give you a reading of how powerful that light is based on f-stops. So if I tell my assistants, I want to shoot at f11, he will measure the light, and if it's at f8, okay, that's a medium-sized hole, but I want to shoot in a smaller size hole, I know, and he knows, my assistant, he or she knows that we need to raise the power because there is a slider, there's a power slider on this. We need to raise that power to a little bit more, or technically one stop difference, to get more power output coming out of the strobe to hit our subjects so that we can stop down that hole to f11. So when we're talking about strobes, it is only measured in f-stops, okay? F-stops or aperture are the only things that directly affect the output of your strobe. All right, hope you enjoyed this video about how aperture directly affects strobe. So in case you feel like you might have missed something in this video series, in the next video, the final video of this entire series, we're gonna recap everything we covered in the entire video series real quickly to make sure that you get a quick refresher and fully understand everything we've talked about. I'll see you there.